Howdy, friends, and welcome back to the Mindful Constitution podcast. Hello, hello. I'm here with a longtime friend and colleague, kind of. We work in similar fields in schools of thought. But yes, Becca Macey. Hello, how are you?
I'm so good. I'm so happy to be here. Very excited.
I know. I'm so excited. I feel like we've been talking about you doing this for a while, so I'm glad we finally are pulling the trigger.
Yeah.
And yeah, so Becca is, like I said, a friend from college. We both got our degrees in psychology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so you went on, though, to get a master's from Leslie.
Yep. And that was in interdisciplinary studies. So I kind of broke off from the traditional psych path there.
Yeah, I feel like Leslie has a lot of breaking off from the traditional psych paths you can take.
Yes.
I love that, though. And so currently you're at Mass College of Pharm as a faculty member, and you are doing health psychology, which is so cool. And I thought would just be such a fun topic to talk about in the lens of health and wellness, health and disease, and also sober curiosity, weaving that in there from your own perspective. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I must say, though, before we dive in, have you been having the same problem I'm having with zucchini?
Oh my gosh. I just shared a reel today that was like somebody looking at the garden in June, like, oh my gosh, our first zucchini, and then flashes to August and they're like dropping them in open car windows in parking lots. It's like,
John sent that to me, that same reel. I was like, this is how I'm feeling right now. I can't like pay people to take zucchini from me.
No, I literally did pay $30 to ship zucchini and cucumbers to my friend in California.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's never ending. I'm like, okay, well, I have made pickled zucchini. I've made lasagna from zucchini. Mm-hmm. We made zoodles last night. Mm-hmm. We're looking into making zucchini fritters, and I've made one other thing. What was it?
Zucchini bread.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
I took your tip and I did the same. Yeah.
Yep. I was like, it said like 2 cups of zucchini or something. I'm like, how about 4? I'm just going to squish it in there. John was like, this zucchini bread's very dense. I was like, yeah. I wonder why. It must have been me like quadrupling the zucchini. But anyways, back to health psychology. So for starters, tell me a little bit about, what that looks like for you in terms of your daily lectures, what topics you touch upon, etc.
Yeah, so I think it is helpful to give just a really brief background on my education and how I got to what I research and teach now. I did start at Emmanuel with you in psychology, and then I took some time off. I transferred to Leslie, and I started in holistic psychology with a concentration in expressive arts therapies, specifically dance movement therapy. And I got really into the world of somatic movement, somatic psychology, dance movement and expressive therapy, and then rolled straight into that master's program in interdisciplinary studies, where I continued kind of a deep dive into somatic psychology. I did training in integrative nutrition coaching as part of that graduate program. I looked at topics as wide-ranging as intuition and altered states of consciousness and shamanic ritual to integrative nutrition and kind of more traditional psychological models of kind of the embodiment of trauma and things like that. So I ended up taking this interdisciplinary approach to the study of human thought, feeling, and behavior. And a big part of that for me has also always been spirit and environment. That's really kind of the holistic view. So then I taught for about 5 years at Leslie and other institutions, very much still in that holistic psych expressive therapies world. I was teaching dance movement and somatic psychology, doing a lot of kind of finger painting and rolling on the dance studio floor, still kind of in that hippie zone that I absolutely thrived in for a long time. But then I found myself at MCPHS, the Mass College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences, as an adjunct, and eventually transitioned to being a full-time faculty member in the health psychology program. And that transition coincided with my growing interest in a field called psychoneuroimmunology. So more of
Mm-hmm.
a kind of neuroscience, neuro nerd approach to
Mm-hmm.
holistic psychology and health psychology. So PNI, psychoneuroimmunology, is really the bread and butter of what I teach. And I teach the specific classes: lifestyle medicine, mind body medicine, and abnormal psychology. But I teach all of those through this lens of psychoneuroimmunology. How do our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and relationships influence our neurological functioning, or are influenced by our neurology, which in turn affects and is affected by the immune system. So that
Right.
trio is kind of my wheelhouse that I'm in.
Mm-hmm. I know. I love psychoneuroimmunology. It's such an interesting way to look at the impact of, it's like mind body medicine in a way, but just kind of specifically with our neurological system, our immune system, and our mindset, thoughts, like you said. It's such, I've been seeing it come up a lot more lately. So yeah, I feel like I remember reading about it in my master's program, and the lens I remember, diving into it was even how, states of being ill affect your mindset, and how sometimes those ways in which it impacts us negatively is actually protective mechanisms, like when we feel fatigued or depressed or antisocial when we're sick. It's
Exactly.
like the way that our immune system impacts our thoughts, but it's also like in this defensive kind
Yeah.
of way, which I think is so cool. So
Yeah.
we talk a lot about how our thoughts impact the way that we feel, but it's interesting to almost look at it the other way.
Yep. We
States of,
talk
go ahead.
Well, P&I talks about the behavioral immune system,
Mm-hmm.
actually, this whole kind of set of behaviors that are driven by the mechanics of the immune system. So, yeah, we just feel like, oh, I don't want to follow through on those plans with that friend today. And we might not have even pinpointed yet that we're feeling physically different than normal or physically kind of under the
Mm-hmm.
weather, but we start to engage in these kind of isolating and self-protective behaviors. And this is kind of launching us off already, but I think this is actually a lot of what we saw happening during the height of the COVID pandemic, with a lot of the xenophobia and the kind of intense polarization and some of the extreme isolation that we saw in society, even once restrictions were lifted. I think a lot of that was kind of a macro level expression of this behavioral immune system, that we
Mm-hmm.
felt our bodies perceived a threat. And so they initiated these behaviors to kind of siphon us off and keep us
Mm-hmm.
enclosed, and
Yeah,
protect.
and it's like individually protective too, but it's also collectively protective if you're going into isolation mode and like self quarantining in a way, So it seems to make sense that we would evolve in a way that, even the initial onset of not feeling well impacts almost our thoughts and
Mhm.
energy more
Mhm.
than us physically at first.
Yeah.
So really cool. You said a couple things, and before we like really dive in, I just want you to be able to like say in your most simplified definition of two things that I think would be helpful for anyone who's not familiar. One is holistic psychology, and the other is somatic psychology. Can you
Mhm.
briefly explain what both of those things mean for anybody who might be
Yeah.
wanting to know more?
Yeah, so holistic psychology is a view of human psychology and human functioning that includes not only the mind, but also the body, the spirit, the environment. So it's really taking a more comprehensive view of the human organism and systems, or kind of groupings of humans together. So recognizing that when a human experiences depression, for example, there are psychological factors, the way that we traditionally think of them: thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. But there are also physical factors involved in that. There are potentially what we might label as spiritual or kind of X factors in that. Energetic factors.
Existential crisis, like what
Existential.
would be considered spiritual elements of depression? Lack
Spiritual
of
elements.
purpose or meaning, or deeper connection to.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Like, meaning is definitely kind of in the Venn diagram of psychology, like mind, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and what we would call maybe spirit, or existential views. For me, spirit, I say X factor because I think it can mean so many different things. I've always been someone who really believes in and experiences energetic shifts. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not something that's really neatly captured by mind or even body in the way that we
Mm-hmm.
typically think about health and wellness or disease. So for me, like anything that would include energy or energetic patterns could belong in that kind of spiritual domain, but certainly, yeah, meaning, purpose, connection to something bigger than ourselves. Yeah, that feeling of being connected to things outside of the self. That's
Mm-hmm.
probably how I would define that.
Yeah, I
And then,
love that.
yeah, and then environment also kind of, it's like the Olympic rings, it's like
Yeah,
a
yeah.
Venn diagram. They all
Yeah.
kind of overlap with each other. So that's holistic psychology, is just expanding the view of human functioning and experience to include these other factors beyond just the
Right.
mind, which is how traditional psychology has kind of severed it for centuries. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then somatic psychology is kind of a focused field within holistic psychology. And it's really just body oriented psychology. So anything that's somatic is just body oriented. So somatic psychology is really diving into that mind body connection. And just a quick caveat there, like we're going to use language like that a lot in this conversation, like mind body connection or mind body interactions. And that's really just a limitation of language, because somatic psychology is really just about the fact that mind and body are two sides of the exact same coin. They are the same thing. It is one interwoven system. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, somatic psychology is just saying, instead of looking at the mind first and then kind of analyzing the ways maybe that can affect the body, we need to look at all of it, body feeding into mind feeding into body, the two of those things seamlessly interacting in every single moment.
Right. Yeah. And when I think of somatic practices, I think of practices we can utilize as tools to intentionally shift our psychology or manage our psychology or optimize our mental health and state, like breath work, or like you said, dance, or things that help us kind of like move emotions through our bodies, process emotions biologically, using our physical body to kind of
Mm-hmm.
move a muscle, change a thought. That's
Yep,
what
perfect.
I would use to explain it myself. So yes, I love this is all such good topics. So let's dive in like phew right away
Oh,
because
let's
we
do it.
got lots of shit to talk about. And so for starters, I know we're focusing on like a systems approach to health and disease. So like really diving into what systems are, how they affect health and disease. And then lastly, we're going to leave you all with tools that you can intentionally integrate to kind of optimize health and wellness.
Mm-hmm.
So, starting, fill us in on what are systems? How are they defined?
Oh my gosh, systems are everything and everywhere. This is probably, if I did like a word analysis of my teaching, it's probably the word I use the most, class after class after
Systems?
class. Systems, yeah.
Yeah.
So I came to the study of systems and using this as a real framework for my teaching through general systems theory. So that was, long time ago. A biologist came up with general systems theory to define and describe what systems are. And he basically said that systems are groupings of interconnected parts that work together to fulfill a purpose or serve some kind of function. So that's the first thing, is that a system is a bunch of different parts that are inextricably linked together, constantly interacting, and with a specific function, purpose, or process at the core, kind of driving those interactions. And
Mm-hmm.
then some of the secondary characteristics of systems are things like every system has some kind of boundary, a place where that system basically stops and other systems begin. But those boundaries can be permeable, they can be semi-permeable, they can be super rigid and closed. And every system is constantly interacting and bouncing up against and exchanging information with other systems.
Mm-hmm.
So while the boundaries are there, they're pretty fluffy. Like they're pretty arbitrary sometimes.
It's like the Olympic rings again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then other properties of systems are things like they're constantly driven to seek homeostasis. They might never achieve it, but they are self-regulating. Any system is by default self-regulating and driven to find and maintain some type of equilibrium. Change to one part of a system affects the entire system. So I like to think of this as the mobile hanging over the crib, where if you kind of tap one dangling piece, it sets the rest of it in motion, sometimes very subtly, sometimes very noticeably, but basically you can't influence a single part without influencing all other parts of a system. So those are some of the core features of a system as we're going to talk about it today.
Awesome. Yes. So definitely sounds like it's filled with lots of nuance overlapping between different systems. So then before diving into what a bunch of systems are as examples, I would love to hear about how these affect health, the manifestation of disease, the manifestation of health. What does systems have to do with either of those things?
All right. So before we get into that, I want to make a quick distinction between general systems theory that I just described and complex systems theory or complexity science, which is a newer branch of science and computational analysis and modeling, and has started to be extremely useful in helping us understand complex disease and public health. So complex disease on both the individual and social levels. So complex systems have all of those same characteristics of any system as described by general systems theory, but complex systems also are chaotic. The parts interact in unpredictable ways and produce unpredictable outcomes, and we call those emergent properties. So this is like an ant colony. Every ant is just operating on its own biological and evolutionary imperatives. It's not thinking, it's not taking orders from some top-down power structure, it's not communicating in a prescribed way with the other ants around it saying, hey, you're going to bring that over there? Okay, I'll bring it over here. Great. They're not doing that kind of planning moment to moment, and there is no top-down power structure. But when you get kind of a critical mass of a number of ants in the same physical space, they will create this complex structure of an ant colony, and they will fulfill all of the needs of that ant colony. There will be ants that go and find food and bring it back. There will be other ants that bury the dead and other ants that take care of the structure of the hive, digging the tunnels, and nobody's telling them what to do. They're just doing it. And it creates this emergent property, this emergent.
It's like an as needed systems development.
Yeah. And it's
like things are evolving as it grows. Systems are kind of like on demand.
Yeah.
The role is created and then filled.
Right. And each one is going to look a little different because there are so many variables. So as soon as you set that ball rolling and it's a system, so one part gets kind of manipulated over here, maybe a certain segment of the ants get squashed inside your house, which is going to change the behavior of all the other ants because now they're following the pheromone trails and they're doing all this other stuff that wouldn't have happened if those ants hadn't been squashed. So each ant colony, even though it follows the same principles and properties, is going to emerge into something slightly different in an unpredictable way.
Because of forces acted upon it by the environment as well, which is just constant variables necessitate adaptability of the system.
Exactly. So the kind of theme here is like the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Right? So we can't understand a human society by understanding one individual person. We can't understand a traffic jam by understanding how one individual car works. Those things emerge out of these interactions between lots of those parts.
Right.
So really, I mention all of that because really when we look at human disease and health, we're looking at complex systems. We're not just looking at a basic system. We're looking at emergent properties and unpredictable, chaotic outcomes, and it's a whole mess, right? There's just so much going on.
Yeah, 100%, which I think makes it really hard in terms of like healthcare and medicine to say one size fits everyone, because it is so many variables that play into the manifestation of disease. And then there's this kind of like looking at the cluster of symptoms as a diagnosis and treating the diagnosis, as opposed to like exploring like, well, wait a second, this same diagnosis can be caused by a variety of like 100 different impacting variables that this person could be dealing with, that we could explore that instead. And I'm big into like the root cause healing approach, which would be exploring those variables instead of like what the symptom or diagnosis may be.
Exactly. And that root cause perspective is really, I think, what a study of complex systems allows us, because when we're not taking a root cause approach, as we so often aren't in our current medical system, we think about, I'll use the example of depression again. Somebody has major depressive disorder. If that's not understood as the emergent property of a complex system or several complex systems, then we're tempted to just slap a Band-Aid on it. We prescribe antidepressants, right? But what that does is it just pokes that part of the mobile and sets the pieces spinning in a whole new direction. It doesn't address the functioning of the system itself. It just influences one variable. It influences one component of the system with unpredictable, chaotic, random outputs then into all these other parts of the system.
Yeah.
So root cause kind of can help us avoid some of that collateral damage.
Right. I think it's yes, I guess I've thought in terms of systems without really realizing that's what I'm doing for a long time now.
Yeah, totally. I feel like anytime you and I go on a walk in the woods, we're basically talking about systems.
Like, oh, it could be this or that. So I think you did a great job of explaining kind of the difference between general systems theory and more complex systems. And it only makes sense that the things, when we're looking at the manifestation in health and disease, would have almost like this kind of random variety of impactors. And I guess not really random, but you know what I mean, that there's a wide spectrum of things that can impact, and combination of those things that can impact us in a way that can promote health or promote disease. And so when we're looking at what all those things are, let's talk about that.
Yeah. So, you know my story well, and we talked before this recording about really kind of explaining some of these more abstract concepts by using myself as almost a case study, like a thing for it. So I think that could be a useful place to go from here. So to start, I think the oversimplified way to introduce this is kind of the list of diagnoses, right? The things that our current medical model has labeled the systemic dysregulation in my body mind as being. So I currently have diagnoses of chronic Lyme disease or Lyme infection, not otherwise specified, of chronic duration, so on and so forth, whatever. Chronic Lyme disease, which is a controversial label, but there it is. That is attached to myalgic encephalomyelitis, also known as chronic fatigue syndrome. But myalgic encephalomyelitis is a preferred term now. It indicates what's actually happening in that disease, which is muscle pain caused by inflammation of the brain and spinal cord. That's what those two words mean together. So I have the chronic Lyme, I have myalgic encephalomyelitis, I have post-COVID syndrome, I have complex PTSD, I have thyroid autoimmune disorder, Hashimoto's disease. So it's this kind of thing. When you look at all of this, it's like, how can one person accumulate so many diagnoses, like trophies, right? Like, it's like, how does one person, did I just hit the jackpot? Like, what's the deal, right? So that question is really what kind of drove me to start looking at all this stuff. I was like, man, another thing? Really? And then once you start peeling back the layers, you start realizing that these are all manifestations of dysregulation of the complex systems that underlie health and disease. We've had to create labels for them out of necessity in our health insurance driven managed care model, but it's really insufficient for capturing what's actually happening. And I can trace back to the very beginning of my life up to now in my mid 30s, how that systemic dysregulation evolved and the chaos and the emergent nature of the diseases that came from that. So starting with preconception and in utero development and birth. Just starting with birth, I had the umbilical cord wrapped around my neck, nuchal cord. So I was born suffocated. I was born bright blue, not having enough oxygen being delivered to my brain. We know that birth trauma of various kinds can contribute to a wide range of health issues throughout the lifespan. There's not nearly enough research on this, in my opinion, but it's just a piece of the puzzle that I've kind of gotten curious about over the years of like, what does that do to a developing nervous system to be deprived of oxygen for the very first minutes of life, right? So that, and then we have early childhood trauma that coincided with exposure to Lyme disease. So I was exposed to a severely toxic infectious agent at a time when my immune system was already compromised by that early adversity. So that was kind of the first perfect storm that set off these systemic interactions. And that kind of just continued throughout my childhood. Early adversity combined with immune assaults kind of over and over again. And so then that was managed by our medical system in my adolescence with really intensive pharmacotherapy. So then that's an input into the system, is all of these psychiatric medications and medical interventions to try to kind of, again, just put a Band-Aid on these different seemingly unrelated physical and mental symptoms that were just constantly popping up. And then that kind of continues into, adolescence lays the foundation for young adulthood. And that cycle continued to repeat over and over again. Exposure to trauma, exposure to an immune assault, connect, and everything kind of goes haywire in a new direction. So by the time, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and when you're not, so with the medications, maybe you're never fully resolving, you're never putting out previous fires and new ones are starting in a way. And so, and side note, I think even when we use the example of like medication for depression, I am all for like utilizing medication when you feel like you need it too. And then like hopefully simultaneously addressing some of the inputs that are, causing the symptoms in conjunction with medication. But yes, it sounds like it was kind of like perfect storm after perfect storm. And the last perfect storm was still storming.
Exactly. No storm fully resolved before the next one landed. But thank you so much for that point. I completely agree. Psychiatric medication and pharmacological intervention of any kind for physical or mental conditions, essential in so many cases. A really incredible tool that our medical model has developed that I am extremely grateful for, and that is invaluable. I think, as you mentioned, though, it's most effective when, and we reduce the risk of harm most when we pair pharmacological intervention with a root cause analysis and this kind of systems-driven approach to healing, which means getting the family system on board, getting the social system and the school system and the physical environment, getting all of that into the mix as well in terms of finding ways to support this new way of functioning that the medication is supposed to engender. Yeah, one by itself is typically not enough.
This actually is making me think a lot, and not to like diverge completely because I know we could go on like a tangent here, but it makes me think a lot about my clients with the idea of like self-medicating with alcohol. And when you actually kind of like remove that, there's many systems that were impacting the life you were leading when you were drinking. And in order to like thrive with the removal of that, it's kind of similarly to like addressing the root cause when you're needing medication. Because a lot of times when we have a dysfunctional relationship with alcohol, it's like medication. It's a form of medication for us. And I'm saying this all because I'm a sober curious coach. So for
Mm-hmm.
anyone listening that's like, what the hell is she talking about? But I do think that there's like a lot of root cause analysis we have to do when we are looking at our relationship with alcohol too, and why we were deciding to self-medicate. And a lot of people kind of forget that, and it's like why it feels so overwhelming,
Right.
sometimes to dig in and really work on the healing, because we realize how many things were contributing to the
Mm-hmm.
illness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think substance use specifically in our society, in our culture here in the United States, the dominant culture being this like hyper productive, hyper competitive, isolated individualist type society, for better and worse. There are pros and
Mm-hmm.
cons of that, but I think we see this heavy reliance on substances for self medication because by the time many people are exposed to substances and they have the opportunity to use them in adolescence or late adolescence, young adulthood, they've also accumulated a whole bunch of crap, just like I did. I'm not unique in the fact that I experienced waves of trauma and disease throughout my life. Unfortunately, I am not unique in that. So I think, as it was for me, I think for a lot of people, alcohol can become just another part of that avalanche of like,
Mm-hmm.
everything's going haywire, everything is dysregulated. I just feel so diseased. I feel so unwell, and nobody's giving me solutions. I have no solutions for this. And then alcohol becomes a very easy solution to deal with some big, overwhelming feelings that come with disease and disability and being uncomfortable because of
Mm-hmm.
physical illness or mental illness. So I definitely experienced that as kind of a fuel to the fire type factor in my own development of chronic
Mm-hmm.
autoimmune disease, because alcohol, of course, is damaging to the internal milieu. It's damaging to our internal systems.
Mm-hmm.
So it is initially a kind of a stopgap measure. People are suffering, they reach out to this substance, it provides temporary relief, but it ends up exacerbating those underlying issues and gets kind of just thrown into the mix of all of these different parts clashing and bouncing off of each other and creating greater and greater dysfunction. So that's
Mm-hmm.
certainly part of the trajectory that I experienced. And then on the other side of it, the removal of alcohol and the addressing of those root causes. Why did alcohol provide relief for me? Why did I need relief in the first place? What did I need relief from? And so now, how do we kind of reverse engineer that so that through the process of healing, we're no longer incorporating that toxic substance that further dysregulates the very systems we're trying to heal?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And just the idea that a lot of times, this, when we are reaching for whether it's like medication or alcohol or any addictive substances, there's reasons why that we can get curious about.
Mm-hmm.
But it is interesting when you had mentioned like individualist and kind of hyper productive, hyper competitive society. I feel like that actually probably manifests as like anxiety and depression in a lot of people. And there's good and bad things about those types of societies that we find ourselves in. But it is interesting to think about too, that like the increased normalization of like being on an anti-anxiety, being on an antidepressant, and like, is it really that this many people are experiencing that, or is it the society or system that is
Yeah.
sick that we're
Yeah.
operating within?
Right. It's like we can almost view epidemics of mental illness, like what we've been seeing increasingly over the last 10 to 20 years. We can almost see that as an emergent property of the cultural system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Yep. So the system is adapting to kind of these pressures or patterns or culture, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
and that results in more of a normalization or dependence on uh, band aids, quick fixes, ways to feel comfortable within a system that kind of makes us inherently uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So, yeah, keep going about how, and use your case study as much as you feel is appropriate to explore more of these like inputs to systems and impactors on health. Like, I would love for you to talk a little bit about, the idea of epigenetics and social determinants of health and all of these different factors, which is what we're kind of talking about with all the variables that can affect the functioning of the system, which in this case, we're kind of talking about ourselves as
Right.
the system.
Exactly. So it's kind of this nesting doll type situation where I think our main point of conversation here is the system of the human organism, like you just said, like ourselves, our whole selves. And so that has, of course, these lower levels, or that's kind of a weird way to say it, but these sub levels of systems. We have a cell is a system. It's a complex system. We have organ systems, right? We have the nervous system, the immune system. So we are composed of many different systems acting together to form this larger system of the whole human organism. But then the human organism is nested in these systems of the family system and the social system, the educational system, the economic system, the cultural system, geopolitical, like out and out and out and out, right? So I think in terms of trying to make this a useful idea for people to understand their own experiences of disease and healing, we'll start by really looking at the human organism system. So kind of going back to my story a bit, we have the overall functioning of the human system that is partially determined through genetics and through the fetal environment, these really early influences, and then is continuously influenced by every single variable that's introduced to that human organism for the entire lifespan. So ideally, you will have a genetic makeup and a fetal environment that supports normative or even optimal functioning of that organism. But very, very few of us have whatever that magic mix is. I don't know a person who does, honestly, so I'm not sure that it exists. But that's kind of the mythical norm that we're aiming toward, is like perfect functioning of the human organism. But in a case like mine, there were all of these variables that got input into that system very early on. So we had some amount of stress during pregnancy. We had the birth trauma itself. And then very early on, we had that psychosocial trauma. And I think it's important to distinguish between what we might call big T trauma and little t trauma. So a big T trauma is a singular event or a series of events unfolding in a relationship or a context that pose an existential threat to the person, that they are at risk of being physically harmed or killed, or that they believe they are at imminent risk of being physically harmed or killed. So that's the big T trauma. Little t trauma is everyone experiences this throughout their entire life. It's feeling rejected. It's feeling not loved or not accepted for who you are. It's losing relationships that are important and special to you. It's not getting opportunities that you feel would really benefit you, that feel like they irrevocably change your life course, that kind of loss. So when I say that I experienced trauma throughout childhood and adolescence and young adulthood, I am referring to big T trauma. There are little t trauma sprinkled throughout, but I think it's helpful to make that distinction. So early in the lifespan, I had a big T trauma, and at the same time, this infectious agent of Lyme disease, which introduced into my system. So the human organism now has these two major inputs of this psychosocial emotional trauma and this infectious exposure. And immediately what starts happening is that my nervous system starts to change in response to those experiences. It becomes hyperreactive and hypervigilant in response to the psychosocial trauma. And then my immune system begins to change in direct response to the infectious exposure. So the immune system is inflammatory. Its basic function when it encounters an injury or an infection is inflammatory, and that's totally vital. It has to be that way. But with an infection like Lyme disease, that is kind of perpetually sending up an alarm signal to the body because it's so sneaky. It's a sneaky little bug, and it just kind of ricochets around the body. It burrows into the actual tissues themselves. It actually will kind of co-opt the functioning of a cell and change through epigenetic mechanisms. It will change the marching orders for that cell. It will initiate cell death. It will reduce that cell's ability to metabolize nutrients and produce the currency of energy, of ATP. It will actually impair the functioning at the cellular level. So that's happening in my immune system, this excessive inflammation, this impairment of cellular function. That's happening simultaneously to this psychological hyperreactivity, hypersensitivity, and hypervigilance to my environmental inputs. So then that hypervigilance ends up feeding into the hyperactivity of the immune system. And the nervous system and the immune system both kind of go off the rails together. Like they're both just driving each other in this positive feedback loop that's uninhibited. They're both just skyrocketing in their reactivity over time.
Yeah. I think it's important to also add that oftentimes we continue to create an environments that validate our internal states too. So it's like even being in a state of hypervigilance, being in a state of chronic fight or flight, like our external environments are often going to like mirror the energy of that state, which I don't know if that could really be considered like you see what you're looking for when you're hyper vigilant. You're like everything to the way, like the noises we hear like more threatening noises when we're in fight or flight. Our vision is narrowed, so we're like seeing things and looking for things in a more kind of fearful way when we're in a state of hypervigilance as opposed to rest and digest. So it's not just like everything is bi-directional, which I feel like is important to say, is like our thoughts shape our reality, but our reality is shaping our thoughts, especially in those core formulative years when we have, like you said, big T traumas that we're left with that then keep us like they're really forming our nervous system to be in a constant state of feeling threatened. And that continues to shape the experiences and environments that we create for ourselves. Not that we are going to be creating every trauma that happens to us, but it is like this potential for things to go both ways, that we can be the victim of our circumstances, which shapes our beliefs and thoughts, but then that kind of shapes what we experience in our environment based on what we're looking for and our subconscious and what it's trying to, our like, you know, subconscious is constantly trying to validate itself with of reality that mirrors our internal state.
Yeah. And our consciousness, our attention prioritizes the things that feel most important. And so when there has been an existential threat, then your attention is going to, in this really adaptive way, it's going to prioritize things that might even be remotely threatening, because that's what experience has told it is going to be important. Like that's the pattern your cognition starts to follow, because it's an adaptive system and it's going to try to protect itself. It's going to try to maintain some type of equilibrium by scanning constantly for that stuff.
I actually am reading this book right now. It's really good. And it talks about this a lot. It's called Addicted to Drama. And it talks about how like early on when we have a variety of systemic inputs that wire us for chaos, that it's like often really hard for us to break out of that. And we kind of become addicted to this cycle of like, we numb out to like escape the trauma, but then we're almost like addicted to chaos to like get us out of this numbed state that we've been in as a protective mechanism. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
But keep going. Sorry.
Well, this is a little side note for anyone who's interested, but that in terms of the neuroscientific kind of analog there, polyvagal theory has a lot to say about that, how that numbed, dissociated state comes from when we actually shoot right past fight or flight, right past sympathetic activation and into the dorsal vagal activation, which is dissociate, freeze, numb, play dead, basically, shut down. So then, yeah, when you're in a state of dorsal vagal activation, you can't connect with other people. That comes from ventral vagal activation. So you have to feel something somehow. And the closest thing you can get to that is to kind of toggle from that shutdown mode back into fight or flight. And it's like,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, it's like you kind of just don't feel alive until you're activated into fight or flight.
right. Otherwise,
Um,
it's numbed. Yeah.
yeah, I know. And I actually encounter that a lot with clients too, because I feel like a lot of people who, and I'm always, and I feel like my case study is relating this back to like, what I see with people with alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
but, and myself, I will use that as a case study as well as this idea that when I was creating so much chaos in my life through dysfunctional drinking, creating a peaceful life felt super uncomfortable at first
Yeah.
because I didn't even know what it felt like to have a calm nervous system most of
Mm-hmm.
the time because I had created a life that was just me constantly like running from myself. And so then it is super uncomfortable to create calm, peace, and it feels a little bit strange. So
Yeah.
if anybody feels that way and they've relied heavily on like immediate gratification, dopamine hits from things that spike at and then leave it depleted, then yeah, it can feel super uncomfortable to then try to sit with yourself.
Yeah. And these are all systems in their own version of equilibrium, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the system is going to try to stay in that comfort zone. It's going to try to stay in that familiar pattern. But this is where we can start to intentionally poke those pieces of the system to allow the rest of it to kind of reconfigure. And it's a it's a gradual kind of ebbing toward a new set point, a new type of equilibrium. But it is typically a pretty slow process to shift from the current version of homeostasis to something new. And that transition can feel super uncomfortable. But I did want to make sure we touched back to social determinants of health because
Yeah.
you mentioned that. And I think it's important also to mention, because I have used myself as a case study here, those things that I experienced that were inputs into the system that fed into the neuroimmune dysregulation that later created autoimmune disease and all of this stuff, all of that happened within a specific context. And that context includes things like I am a white middle class woman from a financially stable family that was not an intact family, but was generally a supportive and safe family environment. I grew up in a town that gave me access to a really good public school system. So I had essentially free, taxpayers, but I had a free, high quality education that prepared me to then pursue additional knowledge and training in these fields, which have ultimately saved my life. Like my higher education has allowed me to heal myself, but that higher education was only accessible because of the economic and educational foundation that I had for me, and because of the privilege that comes from my intersectional identity of being white and being solidly middle class and having access to that education and that economic kind of strata. So I do think it's really important in the discussion of systems driven disease and healing to acknowledge that things like education, economics, access to healthcare, the social community that somebody has available to them in terms of social support or lack thereof, the norms and customs of the social group, all of that. Things like the built environment. I grew up in a suburban area, so I didn't have high exposure to things like environmental pollutants or noise pollution or light pollution that disrupted my sleep throughout my childhood. I wasn't living in an overcrowded apartment building with lead paint. I didn't have that built environment, those elements of a built environment that would have further impaired my
Right.
biological functioning. So all of these different systems, economy, education, healthcare, society, environment, those are all major inputs into the system. And so the fact that I was so privileged in all of those areas and the inputs I experienced still had the capacity to undermine my health so significantly, really, when I started studying this stuff, opened my eyes, and it was like, wow, no wonder we see 3 to 4 times the maternal mortality rate in African American women as we do in white women in this country. It's not only racism embedded into the medical system, it's also all of those social determinants of health for that woman's entire lifespan leading up to the moment of birth.
Even stress itself is such a multifaceted one, because we all experience like some element of psychological stress, probably physical stress at various points in our lives. But then depending on what your other social determinants of health are, education level, finance level, community, the neighborhood you live in, access to transportation, easily access to food, healthy food, access to healthy transportation, like all of those social determinants of health can also impact the levels of stress people are experiencing as well. I mean, clearly we're going to have much higher levels of stress if we're not falling in optimal places in those other strata, as you like called it, right?
Yeah.
So even like one input to the system can have such a different impact depending on a million of the other inputs, which is why it's so important to, in my opinion, really start integrating more of this like root cause approach into medicine. Because if somebody has completely different inputs and causes to the manifestation of symptoms, then yeah, it just seems only like sensible to deal with those. But it is a business after all.
Yeah. It's,
So sorry, go ahead.
well, I think thinking of it in this systems way of that it's all of these things all at once, like everything everywhere all at once, right? We have all of these social determinants of health. We have the psychosocial emotional experience of stress, the interpersonal experience of stress, which is neurobiological at its core. That is a neurochemical, neurobiological experience. And we know that things like perceived discrimination, when somebody believes that they have been discriminated against, whether or not the perpetrator of that would say they were actually discriminating or not, doesn't matter. The person believes and perceives that they have been discriminated against. We know that that changes the functioning of their neurochemistry and their neurobiology. It impairs the connection between the reasoning and executive functioning part of the brain with the emotion regulation centers, the memory centers, the movement centers. I mean, it is a major input into the neuroimmune system. And so I think in this conversation about like, okay, these are all of the ways that variables and factors in the system contribute to disease. Well, then we also need to look at it on the healing side. So when we hear these broad social conversations about like political correctness, for example, and like, why is it so important to be so politically correct all the time, and identity politics and all of this stuff. And it's like, well, we know that discrimination and marginalization are actively killing people by taking years off of the lifespan through these neuroimmune pathways that ultimately contribute to outcomes like cancer and Alzheimer's disease and diabetes and heart disease. So we know that we are affecting morbidity and mortality. Lupus, for example, autoimmune disease, relatively rare, but affects significantly more women of color than any other group. So these constant stress inputs that are based just on identity, the body and self that somebody moves through the world with, and the ways that the world responds to that, is increasing somebody's likelihood of developing a life-threatening autoimmune disease. So it's like, I just think if more people knew about the actual biological effects of attitudes, then the conversation would maybe be a little different. So when we talk about systems-driven healing, it's not just about regulating the neuroimmune system through individual practices, which we can touch on. It's also about regulating the societal system to reduce those toxic inputs to the individuals.
So tell me more about how how do you see regulated systems regarding the input to the human? Like, what shifts can we make in
Mhm.
some of these more collective systems that do reduce the exposure to feeling stress based on perceived discrimination, as an example? So you said attitudes can really make a difference. So can you elaborate a little more on
Sure. I
what you
think,
think could be beneficial in terms of shifts we could make in the
yeah, I think we're at the beginning of many that could ultimately be helpful, and we've got a long, long way to go. But I think really rigorously examining our attitudes and our implicitly held beliefs about ourselves and about other people, it's often, I think, easiest to start with ourselves. Like if I notice that I'm constantly really harshly judging myself when I feel like I'm being lazy, well, then that gives me information. It says that I am most likely going to direct that judgment to other people at some point
Mhm.
when the opportunity comes up. So, like, if that's the easiest way to kind of start digesting the information, it's like, what are the prejudices that I have toward myself that come up often? And then how do I notice myself putting those on other people? But, like, really interrogating our own attitudes and belief systems, which often were constructed by these systemic forces during our formative years and aren't really ours to begin with. So it's like,
Right.
why not get rid of them? Why not deconstruct them? Why not get really critical of them while still being loving towards ourselves and saying, like, yeah, that attitude doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense when I put it under the light. And then I think the next important step there is language. It's like we have to identify the beliefs and the feelings that get triggered when we're out in the world interacting with people. And then we, I think, should be making really conscious efforts to learn and to shape our language to be more inclusive of the amazing amount of diversity that's in the world. So it's like, it can feel frustrating. Like, I'm not allowed to say this anymore. And now I have to say this, and it's better to say this and not that. But it's progress, not perfection, you know? And if we just are trying to interact with each other in a more curious and loving way to make people feel welcome and accepted moment to moment, whether that's in the line at the grocery store or in like a more high stakes environment, like a genuine social interaction. I think that goes a long way towards starting to kind of equalize this playing field that currently exists where like any social interaction a person walks into, if there are observable differences outwardly between those people, there's a power dynamic there. So it's
Mhm.
like, how do we shift our own attitudes, our own beliefs, and our language and our interactions to try to neutralize those power imbalances moment to moment so that no one person is feeling defeated. They're not feeling, these are like terms in the scientific literature: social defeat, social restraint. Those are the types of experiences that activate those changes in the brain and the immune system that ultimately compromise health. So, as much as
Right.
we can try to neutralize those experiences of defeat or restraint or isolation for other people through our own behavior and language, I think is really important.
Do you think that because I would say on paper, I feel like oftentimes I'm like, yes, I fully agree with that. And then other times I feel like, is there a way for us to achieve that level of like compassionate conversation and curiosity and inclusivity without like an overcompensation or beginning to like feel like
Mm-hmm.
policing each other? I've seen a lot of like policing of other like morality policing in a way where it feels like, does that seem constructive either? Like, is this creating a conducive environment for people to get curious if the minute you say the wrong thing, you're like condemned? So, how do we construct a environment which allows for people to be both gracious about getting it wrong, or and also for other people to want to like extend curiosity and inclusivity, if that makes sense, where it's kind
Totally.
of like getting all sides of the equation to be open-hearted and curious, as opposed to like this, like you said, it's almost like the power struggle constantly shifts between like overcompensating and then like having an upper hand on people being like, this is the new way that we're doing things. And then people kind of push back to that because it's almost approached in a way that's like, if we're not like constantly conforming to this, then you're ignorant or like and I feel like that's not helpful in helping people shift either. You know what I mean?
I think you nailed it. There were two big themes of what you were just saying that I think are dead on. And one is that when we address some abuse of social power by slamming the person down, that's just a new power dynamic. That's just, now we're just shifting the power somewhere else and we're defeating a different person. But it's all that power defeat thing.
And it feels like our society really likes doing that in ways that don't feel productive, where it's like, okay, like there's been many like situations where it's like, clearly, like this is an issue that needs to be addressed. Like clearly these different things along the way are things like discrimination. We want to, like, I think many people I know and myself, like I would think agree, like that's something we don't want. But how do we create an environment where people feel open to learning? And that's just an example, but people feel open to learning without fear of saying the wrong thing, because then it's just like been this era of cancel culture and feels, and I don't know if it's a perceived thing that I notice or if you would agree, that it can feel like people are at each other's throats often, where it's like, I mean, I think the majority of people fall somewhere in the middle where it's like live and let live. And how do we create a environment where we can all live differently but still accept each other, allow people to feel like, yeah, maybe I wouldn't make that choice, but like I'm also not judging you for making that choice or whatnot. So I feel like there's such a middle ground that we could strike that it seems like we miss the mark societally a lot.
For sure. And I think the second thing you said that really nailed it is kind of the answer there, which is curiosity. And you and I talk about this all the time in our friendship offline. But the idea that kind of the antidote to a lot of this is curiosity. And it's so non-threatening and it's so accessible. It's like in the moment when you hear somebody say something that kind of perpetuates these power dynamics or might create that stress response in the person they've directed it to, or if you're that person who it's been directed to, being curious and saying, I wonder why you chose to say that way. Like, I want to understand better what you were trying to say there, because this is what I heard and I'm not sure if you meant that. Like genuine curiosity, like was that the word that you meant to use? Because I would probably use this other word, but I want to know why you spoke the way that you did. Like assuming good intent, even if the impact was bad, assuming good intent and being curious about where that person is coming from. It's the difference between calling in and calling out is the language we might use. It's like calling somebody out is like, that was racist and that is wrong and you need to apologize right now because that was a horrible thing to say. That's calling out. Nobody's going to respond well to that. Calling in is like, I wonder what you meant by that comment. Like, can you tell me more about what you were trying to express there? It's like bringing them into the conversation instead of pushing them out.
Yeah, 100%. Totally agree. And I think that what you said too about assuming positive intent is so important, because I think there is so many narratives about different groups of people and this and that. And it's like you absorb, like we were saying, a lot of beliefs that aren't our own or programming. And then you kind of create stories in your head about like what a certain person that holds this belief is going to be like, also X, Y, and Z in this group, because like they think one way about this one thing. Whereas, and I notice a lot in conversation over whatever heated topic has come up in the past 5 years, like take your pick of things that people have been like very like at odds regarding. But I often see people just really digging into defending themselves instead of getting curious. And it's like, when both people are just defending their own views without getting curious, it's like you said earlier, many of our views aren't even really ours to begin with. And many people haven't done the inner work to see why they even hold the beliefs that they hold or the programming they hold, and they aren't even aware that it's dictating their behavior and their interpersonal relationships and the way that they're viewing other people, and that they're automatically like using those beliefs as a foundation to judge someone for holding an opposing belief in maybe one area that opposes theirs. You could have 95% of things in common other than that one thing that you're like, oh, I don't, align with people who do this or that. Granted, there's exceptions to that. I'm sure, if somebody murders someone, yes, I don't align with that. But generally speaking, there is things where maybe I wouldn't agree with one person, someone doesn't mean that we're need to be like at each other's throats. And yeah, needless to say, my whole point is just the curiosity component is so important, and I feel like it's really lacking, and most people are just trying to defend like, why am I oppressed and what's my like issue that I deserve to be like heard regarding, whereas if we were all more curious about each other, I think it would be a beautiful world. Becca,
I know. I think at the end of the day, so many people just feel like, God, my pain matters. Like my pain
yeah,
matters. Why isn't my pain being seen and heard and cared for? And it's like, that's just a sad state of affairs. That like the vast majority of us are carrying burdens that we need to be relieved of.
and it circles back to the fact that it's like kind of a result of systems. And so how do we like fix these systems that are contributing to the manifestation of disease for so many of us, whether it's even like disease within our culture and sickness within our society? Like, you could argue that many of the systems, like the political system, is that intended to keep us in a state of health? I don't even know.
we,
Like, could be argued that this likes us being, divided. And the healthcare system, there's so many beautiful people that work in it. However, like, is it in its current functioning? And it's funny because I was having this conversation with family recently. We were talking about how, within the healthcare system, um, like I'm into holistic health, and I think the healthcare system could use some evolving. That said, I don't like condemn individuals working within the healthcare system. I think that they've worked really hard to get where they are. They think that they go in with the intention of helping people, but within the system itself, there's only certain tools and education provided to them to address disease.
Yep.
And so it's like when we stop getting so defensive about, you're saying this, so does that mean this, and extrapolating it to all these other like perspectives you're assuming that I have, is like, well, if you talk to me, you would know that I don't think that people in healthcare are evil or something, but I do think that it's not like mutually exclusive, that you think healthcare could use improvement, but yet you respect and admire all the people working within it.
Absolutely not. Yeah. And I just want to make I feel like I need to say this one thing that like when you asked, how can we begin to shift these societal systems that do rely on these power imbalances and create these predispositions to disease based on inequality and all of that. And I leaned right into this idea of what can we as individuals do to kind of from the ground up, in this emergent kind of way, individual by individual, shape a new society. Because I think for your listeners, maybe that's what's most relevant. But I want to be very clear that I believe simultaneous, kind of in parallel to that, we do actually need to change the systems themselves, like people who are in positions of power, people who are in political positions, or who are in economic advisory positions, like places where we see this great inequality, people who are part of housing associations and in a position of power on a housing board for a medium-sized city. Like there are so many different cogs in the machine of these different systems that can also be doing that work. But like, we do need to actually create systemic opportunity for people who have been historically marginalized. Like the individual getting curious about my attitudes, shaping my language, changing my interactions, super important. But I in no way want to put the burden of that responsibility on any one person, because it's not ours to hold. This is the burden of the system itself. And there does need to be actual systems-wide change.
And then to my point, again, like just because you're expressing like individual changes we can make doesn't mean that you're excusing inequity in systems that have been oppressing or marginalizing certain groups of people for a long time, and that you can think both need
Right.
evolution and growth and change. And that, to add on when we make changes on an individual level, I always say the ripple effect, because I do feel like sometimes the act of changing systems themselves feels really challenging, and a lot of people are like, I can't make a difference. But I do genuinely think that the more that we can make changes on an individual level, get more curious, as you said, like, the sum is the total is greater than the sum of the parts, or
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I
The
know the
whole.
quote.
Yep.
We know it, right?
We do.
Say
Yes.
it
The
for me.
whole. The whole is greater.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. But I do think on an individual level, as each one of us do self-inquiry, do examine our programming and beliefs, do get more curious in our interpersonal relationships, and influence the people and around us in our immediate realities, and start the shift that way, like, that's going to demand that systems change. The more that people start to self-reflect on, like, what are my values, like, what do I really believe, does this land with me that these systems are operating this way, I think it's a level of consciousness that we're achieving that's going to demand that systems also feel in alignment with the new developing consciousness we're achieving. Whereas, like, when we're just kind of on autopilot, not doing self-inquiry, being like, well, I can't change anything anyways, like, just living my life kind of in this mindless way, a
Yeah.
lot of times I feel like it's just easy to stay checked out and just let the systems run as they have been, you know?
Yeah. And this, I think, is a perfect little bow to kind of bring us all the way back and close the loop on complex systems. I'm right now, my mind is being absolutely shattered by this amazing book, Notes on Complexity by Neil Thies. And he talks about this property, this defining property of complex systems being that all interaction is local interaction. There is no such thing as like global top-down organization. All interaction, all change and functioning in a system is the emergent property of countless local one-on-one interactions over and over and over again. And this is supported by quantum physics. Like, this is
Right.
supported by quantum mechanics and quantum physics and complexity theory and science that I can't even begin to understand. But what it boils down to is that there is no top-down organization of these large systems. It is all emergent from these local interactions. So the idea of do what you can in your little corner of the world is actually supported by the science that taught us how the universe formed. Like, it's real. It's really important.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And it's funny because John just asked me the other day, like, what inspires you to focus as a health coach and sober curiosity? Like, if somebody asked you, what would you say? And I said, like, I feel like for me personally, not drinking gave me a lot of clarity to see a lot of dysfunction within the systems of the world. And that was really overwhelming for me to look at things from a top-down way, to look at the systems, the food system, the healthcare system, the political system, the economical system,
Ooh.
all of the things and how they're tied together, and just in ways that I don't think would I just feel could be conflicts of interest, etc. There's ways in which it was really overwhelming and paralyzing.
Yeah.
And for me, that is exactly how I chose to look at, like, how do I want to help create the impact I want to create in the world? If I help people to step away from self-medication, to get comfortable in their own skin, to really explore, like, not everyone has a toxic relationship with alcohol, but many people do. And if we stop checking out and we check in, lean in, like you were saying, like, instead of like getting defensive or whatnot, like really getting curious, like, how can I create a positive change? And now that I have the bandwidth to do it, and I'm consciously showing up to my life. And so that's kind of the basis for my work too, is like, I just want to help people be the best version of themselves so that they can go out and have the impact they want to have and live in a conscious way. Because when we look at it the other way, it's just, it is paralyzing. It is something that feels too overwhelming to tackle. But there's some quote, I forget who said it, but it's like, the wise man knows that in order to heal the world, he has to heal himself, or something like along those lines. And I think it's so true that it's like, until on individual levels, like, we are able to work through our own exploration of self, of traumas, of things that are impacting us in ways that may be toxic, and we're bringing that toxic energy out into the world. Like, how do we expect to change systems in a positive way if our own energetic field and health and mind, body, and spirit is out of whack?
Right. If the system is scanning for threat and conflict, it will find threat and conflict. So I need to recalibrate my system to know what safety and peace and connection feels like, so that I'm then scanning for and cultivating that, which is going to ripple out, as you said so beautifully earlier, just ripples outward.
Yeah, definitely. Such a cool conversation. We didn't even talk about the microbiome. How did we not talk about the microbiome?
Okay, can we just very quickly, the anecdote about when we met up after like 10 years of not hanging out and realized that we went to the beach. We hadn't seen each other in forever. We had a beach hang, and we started talking about the microbiome and realized that we are both obsessed with the importance of the microbiome as this like glorious system. And I forget which one of us said it first. I think it might have been you. You said, I think like bacteria is like spirit. And I almost like grabbed you and shook you. I was just, bacteria is spirit. Like, we were just like foaming at the mouth over this, what would have seemed like a totally nonsensical statement to anybody else. And we were like, oh, we have found each other. It's been 10 years and we have found each other.
Which is funny. I think too, I was like, I feel like the composite, like, it's our intuition.
That was it.
Bacteria. Yeah, like the composition of our bacteria is like, the more that we take care of our vessel and have this like healthy composition of bacteria, the more we can listen to our inner knowing. I was like, I swear science is going to say that the microbiome is the voice of our intuition.
Yep. Sure is.
Yeah, it was a little hole we went in, but it really made sense to both of us.
I still believe it. But yeah, we were going to talk about like ways to regulate the neuroimmune system and like how we can address the microbiome to stimulate our own healing. We'll just have to, I'll have you on my podcast. I'll start a podcast just for that.
Well, or we can always do a part 2 as well. But I wanted to, if you could share just in closing, and it's okay if we go a little over. This was a dense episode. There's lots to talk about, and we'll definitely have to do another one too, because I think what would be really cool is picking your brain about like the psychology of addiction and alcohol removal and stuff like that from a health psychology perspective. Could be really cool for listeners as well. But I wanted you to close out by sharing a few things, individual and collective practices. And I know we kind of touched upon the collective, but
so the individual practices that have been most radically health shifting for me, and Katie knows that I'm currently about 3 months out from an 18-month period of pretty severe disability. So this is very fresh for me that I've really put these tools into use yet again in a concerted way and seen a remarkable result from that. So even though I do or have historically ebbed and flowed out of disability and severe chronic illness, these tools have accumulated to pull me out of each setback with greater resilience every time. And this time I'm now the healthiest I have ever been in my 34 years. And I really owe it to these tools. So some of them are from external practitioners. Like I have a phenomenal acupuncturist. I really do believe in the wisdom of the traditional Chinese medical model and the ways that it influences the energetic system, which is completely overlooked in.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was
So
going to
I do
say
think
that.
that's a really, it's not accessible for everybody, unfortunately, but there are community acupuncture clinics that offer sliding scales. Often you can go into a community room, quiet, peaceful place with 4 or 5 other people and pay maybe $15 for an acupuncture treatment. So there are more accessible versions of it, but that's a practice from a practitioner that's been really effective. But me personally, it's been a lot of nervous system regulation through things like breath work, and I don't do well often because of my tendency toward nervous system dysregulation with seated meditation, like seated silent meditation, but mindfulness in all of its forms. So for me, this looks like washing the dishes as mindfully as possible or eating a meal as mindfully as possible, lots of time in nature. That does have direct physiological inputs, everything down from, the types of ions that are released from the soil when we step on it and the smell that goes into our nostrils, which is actually a chemical feeding into this, all that kind of stuff. But also just
Inputs.
meditative. The what?
Inputs to the system, honey.
Inputs to the system, always. And so, or like the smell of ocean air, like that's a really potent input to the system that can really kind of calm us, I think, on a primordial level. So time in nature allows me to practice mindfulness in an immersive way that's much more accessible for my nervous system. So a lot of that, gardening is part of that, hence all the zucchinis. But HRV biofeedback has probably been the single biggest game changer. HRV is heart rate variability. And just to keep it simple, it's basically just a measure of how flexible and resilient our nervous system is. So how easily can we toggle between fight or flight and rest and digest? And for people with trauma histories or people who experience chronic stress, we tend to have really low HRV. It's like a really rigid system. We kind of get locked into the fight or flight mode, and it's harder to toggle back out. So by practicing with biofeedback, I have a device that allows me to do that. I can increase my HRV, which then means that my nervous system is just more agile. It's just more adaptable and more flexible, so that when I do experience a momentary stressor, I don't stay stuck in that stressed mode for 2 days, right? I can come back down to baseline more easily. So that's really helped get the set point of my nervous system back to a healthier baseline, so that I'm not operating from fight or flight 90% of the time anymore, like I was for most of my life. So that allows the whole neuroimmune apparatus to come back to a healthier version of homeostasis. So HRV biofeedback, mindfulness does something very similar, just kind of with our onboard technology, like no devices needed, but it's a similar process that it's working on. And just moving my body in any way that I can. So for me, that's like swimming in the ocean, walking in the woods, Pilates. I like to run now that I'm physically able to again. So just getting into my body in a mindful way, regulating my nervous system, whether that's through kind of immediately accessible practices like mindfulness that you don't need equipment for, or through more advanced kind of biofeedback practices like HRV biofeedback. And then diet, nutrition is absolutely essential because of the gut microbiome and the ways that feeds into the
And
neuroimmune
because
system.
lots of pesticides, etc., are also introducing toxins to the system. So there's
Mm-hmm.
like, depending on what you're choosing to eat and what's on it, within it, it can
Yeah.
be. I always tell people when I'm explaining calories, because people, lots of along the way have been taught, counting calories, which is just the opposite of how I feel in terms of my approach to nutrition, pretty much altogether. But
Mm-hmm.
I always explain calories as information to your cells. And this ties back into epigenetics as well, where it can really, depending on what information you're feeding your body based upon the choices you're making, gives your body very different instructions. And that goes to expression and repression of different genes. So important,
Mm-hmm.
nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, I feel like a lot of what you talked about is things that are kind of just helping to you to get into rest and digest to calm
Mm-hmm.
your nervous system, because the goal really is to like avoid anything that is exacerbating inflammation, it sounds like.
Right. Right. But, you know, an interesting thing is another tool. Sorry, I choked on my tea while you were talking.
It's okay.
I had to mute and cough for a minute. But another set of tools that I've used that's really helpful is a bit counterintuitive, and these are called hormetic stressors.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
yeah, hormesis is like intentionally stressing your body out so that it learns how to come back down to baseline with greater resilience. So I do cold plunges.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a form of like, I mean, it's like everything we've talked about. Nothing is as simple as either or. It's both
Right.
and. Like stress is necessary, and there is such a thing as healthy and
Well,
good
and
stress.
stress is like healthy, good stress, and hermetic stressors is intentional. And you can do this through breath work as well, where
Mm-hmm,
there's ways
mm-hmm,
to activate your sympathetic nervous system, which is also fight or flight mode, intentionally in order to then like go into a deeper meditation. So there's strategy behind intentional activation of your fight or flight response in like a controlled way,
mm-hmm.
to kind of, like you said, it's almost strengthening your resiliency and adaptability and flexibility to kind of create a space where you can kind of opt to and like train yourself on how to come out of fight or flight mode as opposed to just unconsciously being in it all the time.
Yeah.
And the other thing you were saying, which I just think ties into everything we've been talking about, is this just like element of being curious with how you feel in your body, like starting to listen to your body when you feel stressed
Mm-hmm.
out. What's going on? Is your heart rate increasing? Is your breath more shallow? Are you sweating? Are you feeling
Yeah.
clammy? Like really being able to tune into those physiological stress cues and getting curious about how you feel throughout the day. Like that mindfulness that you touched upon is so important. And just, I think the at the crux
Mm-hmm.
of it, that was what we were talking about, even with more collective healing too, is
Yes.
curiosity. Like really embracing this constant spirit of curiosity, I think is going to be really helpful for not only your own like individual healing, but also for collective healing, because I feel we're in a time right now where we're really evolving out of black and white thinking and boxing people in. I think, in our parents' generation, it was much more like, I'm a Republican and you're a Democrat, just as like a very basic example. But it's like now there's just many more boxes people can check off, and just different things that like we're starting to realize as humans we're much more complex than that. And we have to kind of extend grace to each other to realize like at our core, we're all humans, which makes us have much more in common than different, even
Yes.
just at a simple baseline.
Yeah. And just very last thing, as a psychology instructor, I would be totally remiss to not mention therapy as a tool.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of like curiosity and getting to know our own patterns and like just the things that therapy has taught me about my own programming and how I tend to view myself and the world and the ways that I tend to respond to stress with very specific behavior patterns that are often maladaptive. Like they came,
Mm-hmm.
they arose as a defense mechanism, as a survival mechanism, and then my life outgrew them, but they stayed around. And it's like, oh, that's why this thing keeps coming up over and over and over again, is because my
Mm-hmm.
response to this kind of stressor is outdated. So therapy has been essential. I don't know that HRV biofeedback and cold plunges and mindfulness and all of those things would be as powerful if I didn't have the primary foundation of having a space every week to get curious about how all these things are affecting me and how my lifestyle and my relationships and my work and all of my daily variables are affecting my system. That's been a
Mm-hmm.
really, really important place to process and zoom out and see the bigger picture and then zoom in and look at the different parts and really start to synthesize a more complete understanding of how my human system operates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can't forget therapy.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, a good therapist is just holding a mirror for you that I think, allows you to explore yourself in a lot of ways and like asking a lot of the right questions. And it can be so powerful because, I think some of our biggest limitations are our unexamined beliefs that we go through our whole life that are just dictating our existence. And if they're unexamined, then it's not even our own chosen thoughts that are dictating our lives.
Right.
And so taking the opportunity to create intentional space for yourself to kind of dissect some of those and see how they're serving you. And like you said, it's again bi-directional. Therapy without somatic integration of practices can feel like a bit of a dead end. And same thing if you're like utilizing somatic practices or habits and you're not taking the opportunity to get curious about your thought patterns and your belief systems and your programming and all of that, the conditioning around your choices and patterns, then those can be kind of a dead end as well. But all together, the 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 whole is greater than the sum of the parts. We did it.
Here it is.
I did it. I Ben taught that quote like a million times, obviously, just in holistic health and functional medicine. And every time I'm like, the sum, the greater. We're great.
I know. It's like not every rectangle is a square. What?
Exactly.
Every
rectangle is a square, but not every something. You get what I'm saying.
Rectangles, squares.
You're the professor. Yeah. You're supposed to be teaching me. Yes. Well, you taught me a lot today, and I think this was such a good conversation, just even to start off, but definitely feel like there's so many more things that we could come back and talk about. So I'll have to have you on again to dive in. But yes, any last closing thoughts, especially for people dealing with chronic disease or whatnot, and also kind of you have a very successful career, demanding job, and you also manage your chronic disease. So any words of wisdom or mantras that you want to pass along for anyone who might need it?
Oh, man. For anyone who's listening to this who experiences complex chronic illness and or disability, I just want to say, I am you. I see you. I've had moments of intense despair where it's felt like this kind of healing that I'm now experiencing is completely impossible. It just didn't even feel remotely accessible to me. And so my big life lesson has been that when I heed the signs, when I listen to what my body mind is trying to communicate to me, which is usually for me some version of slow the hell down, when I listen to that and I just do the next right thing, whether that's drink a glass of water or request a medical leave of absence from my job, however big or small the next right thing is, if I just do that, which often requires asking for some help or just letting the people around me know, I don't even feel like I can take a shower right now. Like that's how deep of a hole I am in. I need help. But whatever it takes to do that next right thing, like the results are cumulative. It might be 3 steps forward, 1 step back, but it does get you there. It's gotten me there over and over again out of some of the hardest places I could have imagined being in to some of the most beautiful. So if you have a moment of that despair or hopelessness and all of this feels way out of reach, it's just the next right thing. And that can be a micro action, but they really do add up. And the system does evolve. It does change with continued directed input like that.
Oh, that was so good. And such a wise piece of advice, not just for people suffering from complex chronic illness, which is also very important, but like literally for anyone working on their healing journey. I know it can seem like it is a uphill battle and you're never going to get there. But like Becca said, these like micro inputs, they really force the system to start operating in a new direction. And that transition can be challenging, but they add up.
Yes.
So, yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so, so
Yes,
much.
thanks for having me. Thanks for coming on and educating us. You're always so eloquent and explain things in such like a concise and digestible way. So I appreciate you chatting with me. And yeah, we'll have to find another time. And until then, we'll have to schedule a walk soon.
That's for sure.
All right,
All
love
right.
you, honey.
Party hugs for me.
I will.
All
Bye.
right. Bye.